Can I join you?" The whole diner held its breath. Caroline Whitaker had walked past the elegant private room set aside for her and cut straight toward the shabbiest little table in the room, ignoring the assistant who reached to stop her. The blizzard swallowed Maple Falls whole. Inside, the yellow light trembled over weathered faces. In the darkest corner, Grant Callahan bent low in his worn coat and quietly slid half a plate of pancakes across the table, his calloused hand stalling for a single beat. He looked up at her, and in that moment she had no idea she had just sat down across from the person who had quietly shaped her entire life. For 22 years. Why had he never said a word? The blizzard had shut down half of Vermont by the time the motorcade reached Maple Falls. 3 black cars crawled through streets no plow had touched in hours' wipers, losing the fight against the snow. In the second car, Caroline Whitaker watched the town slide past the window-shuttered storefronts, a church steeple wearing a white-capped strings of lights swaying over an empty square. She had built an empire across 3 continents, yet something about this small, buried place tightened her chest in a way boardrooms never had. Across from her, Preston Vale worked his phone, with both thumbs, the glow washing his face pale. He had planned the evening down to the minute arrival at the inn, a private suite 40 minutes to rest, then the gala. Everything about tonight had been engineered to be flawless, because flawless was what kept the foundation's name clean. The gala was for the county group home, the same one she had aged out of at 18 with nowhere else to go. She had said yes to the invitation without hesitation, and regretted it 100 times since. She had come to repay a debt she could never fully name, to a town she had spent her whole adult life trying to forget. Then the lead car braked hard, and the whole procession shuddered to a stop. A delivery truck had jackknifed at the intersection ahead, blocking the road in both directions. Preston was already on the phone with the inn, his voice clipped, arranging an alternate route that would take another 20 minutes through streets, no better than this one. Outside, the wind howled. Through the frosted glass, Caroline saw a soft rectangle of yellow light spilling onto the snow, a diner still open, the only warm thing on the block. "We'll wait inside," she said, reaching for the door handle. Preston looked up sharply. "Miss Whitaker, the inn is minutes away. There's no reason to—" But she was already stepping out into the cold, and by the rules that governed his life, that meant he had to follow. The sign above the door read, "Brooks Diner," in hand-painted letters, one bulb flickering at the end. A little bell rang as Caroline pushed inside, and the warmth hit her at once. Coffee griddle smoke, the low hum of a place that had fed the same faces for decades. Heads turned. Then slowly, recognition rippled across the room. Behind the counter stood Evelyn Brooks, a broad, gray-haired woman with flour on her apron, and the steady eyes of someone who had seen every kind of person walk through that door. She did not gasp or fuss. She simply nodded, as if a billionaire stamping snow off her boots at 9 at night was nothing worth losing composure over, and said the only thing that mattered. "Sit anywhere you like, hon. Coffee's fresh." Caroline meant to take the nearest booth and wait out the wreck. She truly did. But her eyes moved across the room, the way they always did in crowded places, searching, never landing that old restlessness she had carried for as long as she could remember, and never managed to explain. Rooms full of people had always made her feel most alone. She could stand at the center of a gala with 300 guests and feel like a woman watching her own life through glass, never quite inside it, never quite belonging to any table there. Her gaze reached the far corner, the darkest one where the light barely fell. A man sat there in a coat worn thin at the elbows, its color faded past naming. Across from him sat a young woman, mid-20s, her own jacket patched at one shoulder. Between them sat a single plate. On it, one order of pancakes. And as Caroline watched, the man took his fork and knife and cut the stack down the middle with a slow, careful precision, portioning it into 2 equal halves before sliding the larger one across to the woman. He did not do it grandly. He did it the way a person does a thing they have done 1,000 times without thought, without any expectation of being seen. His hands were the hands of a man who worked with them, thick knuckles, a healing scrape across one, and yet they moved over that cheap plate with something close to tenderness. The young woman said something quiet. He shook his head and pushed the plate an inch closer to her, keeping the smaller share for himself. Caroline forgot the wreck. She forgot Preston, forgot the gala, forgot the 300 guests waiting for a version of her that had been rehearsed and approved. She stood in the middle of Evelyn Brooks's diner and could not look away from a stranger dividing a single plate of pancakes, and she could not have told anyone why her throat had gone tight. There was something in it, something old, a shape she recognized from a place she could not reach. "Miss Whitaker." Preston had come up beside her, his voice low and careful. "The car should be clear in 15 minutes. Let me get you a seat by the window." She did not answer. She was moving. Caroline. He rarely used her first name. He used it now, and it carried a warning. "Whatever this is, please, not tonight. There are people who photograph everything. You know how a moment like this reads." He meant it as protection. She understood that even then. Preston had spent 6 years standing between her and the 1,000 small disasters that could take a public woman apart. And once, years ago, he had failed, and a single careless image had nearly cost the foundation everything they had built. He had never forgiven himself, and he had never let it happen again. To him, this dim corner and this ragged man were not a person and a plate. They were a risk with no upside, a photograph waiting to be misunderstood. But Caroline had spent 40 years doing the safe thing, the rehearsed thing, the thing that kept the glass wall intact. And something in that corner was pulling at a thread she had knotted shut a long time ago. She crossed the room. The conversations died as she passed forks, lowering cups, going still every eye in the diner, following the woman in the white coat toward the poorest table in the house. The man looked up as her shadow fell across the plate. Up close, he was older than his posture suggested, perhaps in his mid-40s, with a lined, honest face, and the kind of eyes that had learned to expect very little and had made peace with it. He did not flinch at the sight of her, did not perform recognition or awe. He only watched her with a quiet, patient steadiness, waiting to learn what she wanted, the way he probably waited for everything. Caroline looked at the empty chair beside their table. Then she looked at him, and the whole diner held its breath as she leaned down, resting one hand lightly on the back of that chair, and asked the question she had not planned in a voice barely louder than the wind. "Can I join you?" For a moment, nobody moved. Behind the counter, Evelyn Brooks set down the mug she had been drying without a sound. Near the window, Preston made a strangled noise low in his throat and took half a step forward, his whole body a plea for her to stop. The young woman across the table stared, her fork frozen halfway to the plate, her eyes flicking between the stranger and her companion in open confusion. The man simply studied Caroline's face as though checking it for cruelty and finding none. "It's a free chair," he said. His voice was rough and even. "Suit yourself." Caroline's fingers tightened on the wood. This was the point where the script ended. She could still smile, offer some gracious excuse, retreat to the window booth, and let the moment dissolve into a story nobody would ever tell. That was the version of herself the world had come to expect, the one who kept everything smooth, who never sat where the cameras couldn't be controlled. Preston was watching her with everything he had, silently begging her to choose it. She pulled out the chair and sat down. A murmur moved through the diner, then folded back into silence. Preston exhaled hard through his nose and stepped back against the wall, defeated for now, his jaw set. Evelyn Brooks picked up her mug again and resumed drying it, but her eyes stayed on the corner table, warm and unreadable. And Caroline Whitaker, who owned buildings on 3 continents and had never once felt at home in any of them, settled into a wobbling chair across from two strangers and a plate of pancakes, and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was clenched. "I'm Caroline," she said. "I know who you are," the man answered, though not unkindly. "Whole town does after that write-up in the paper about the gala." He set his fork down. "Grant, this is my daughter Sophie." The young woman gave a small, guarded nod, still plainly wondering what a woman like this was doing in a chair like that. Her jacket was clean, but old mended with care rather than money, and there was a fierceness in the set of her mouth, the look of someone who had learned to watch out for her father, because no one else would. She pulled the plate a fraction closer to him, a quiet redirection, as if to remind them both whose meal this was. "You didn't have to do that," Grant said to her low, and pushed it back to the middle. Caroline watched the small, wordless argument pass between them. Two people who clearly had almost nothing negotiating over who got the larger half of a $2 breakfast each, trying to give it to the other. She had sat at tables where the wine alone cost more than this diner made in a night, and she had never seen anything like the ordinary, unremarkable generosity happening in front of her right now. It undid her a little. "Have you lived in Maple Falls long?" she asked, mostly to fill the silence, mostly because she did not want to leave. "Long enough," Grant said. He turned his coffee cup a slow half-circle on the table without drinking it. "Work down at the freight yard when there's loading. Fill in at the kitchen here when Evelyn's short a pair of hands. It comes and goes." He said it plainly without complaint, and without apology, a man simply reporting the weather of his own life. Snow like this, the yard shuts down. "So," he tipped his head at the pancakes, "we came in out of the cold same as you. There was no bitterness in it. No angling, no glance at her coat or her rings to measure what she might be worth to him. Preston had seen only a man positioned to profit from proximity to money. But Caroline, sitting close enough to read his face, saw something else entirely. She saw a man who had made peace with going without, and who spent what little warmth he had on the person across from him. She had been trained her whole life to spot the people who wanted something from her. This one wanted nothing at all, and it disarmed her more than any request could have. "Miss Whitaker." Preston's voice again tight from just behind her shoulder. He had crept back within reach, phone dark in his hand. "The road's cleared. The inn is ready for you." When she did not rise, he leaned closer, lowering his voice to something meant only for her. "People are watching. This, whatever this looks like, it isn't the image we've built. Please." Caroline heard him. She understood exactly what he was protecting, and part of her even agreed with it. But she looked back at Grant, at the careful halves on the plate, at the daughter who guarded him, and she thought about the group home a few streets away, where she had learned at 18 that kindness given without expectation was the rarest currency in the world. "Give me a few more minutes, Preston," she said quietly, without turning around. He stood there a beat longer, then retreated once more to the wall, and this time he did not argue. Outside, the wind kept up its low howl against the glass. Evelyn Brooks came by with the coffee pot, filled Caroline's cup, without being asked, refilled Grant's, and moved on without a word, sensing something at one of her tables, and knowing better than to interrupt it. Grant watched Caroline over the rim of his cup, and for the first time something crossed his face that she couldn't quite read, a flicker there, and gone as if her presence had stirred a thought he wasn't going to speak. He looked at her a moment too long, then down at his coffee, and the moment closed over. But she was too busy noticing how strange it felt to sit at a table and not want to leave it. "You didn't come in here just to wait out a wreck," Grant said at last. "It wasn't a question. Woman like you's got a warm car and a warm room and a driver to sit in the cold for her. But you came in and you sat down here. Why?" Caroline opened her mouth and found she had no rehearsed answer, which almost never happened to her. "I don't know," she said, and it was the truest thing she had told anyone in years. "I saw you split that plate, and I couldn't walk past it. She looked down at her own hands at rings worth more than everything these two people owned. I've spent my whole life in rooms full of people, and I've never once felt like I had a table. Then I walked in here, and there you were giving yours away. Sophie's guarded expression shifted just slightly, the first crack in her armor. Grant said nothing for a long moment, only looked at Caroline with those patient, weathered eyes, and something in his stillness told her he understood exactly what she meant. Understood it far better than a stranger should. "Sit as long as you want, then," he said finally, and pushed the smaller half of the pancakes toward her side of the table the way he had pushed the larger half to his daughter. "There's enough." It was such a small thing. A man with almost nothing offering a share of it to a woman who had everything. But Caroline Whitaker looked down at that cheap plate and felt her eyes sting for no reason she could name, and outside the storm went on burying the town, and none of the three of them yet knew that the past had just walked into the room and pulled up a chair. Preston could not stand it any longer. He stepped away from the wall and came to the edge of the table, sliding his phone into his coat pocket in a way that meant he intended to be heard. He had watched his employer sit for 10 minutes in the poorest corner of a roadside diner, and every instinct he had honed over 6 years told him this was a mistake unfolding in real time. "It's a good act," Preston said, looking down at Grant with a thin, practiced smile. The worn coat, the one plate cut so carefully in half, it's very moving. He let his gaze drift over the man's frayed sleeves as though pricing them. "But you know who she is. Everyone in this town does, thanks to the paper. And people who know who she is tend to find a reason to sit close, tell a sad story, wait for the checkbook to come out. So let's save each other the time. What is it you're after?" The diner went quiet again, but it was a different quiet now, sharper embarrassed on Grant's behalf. Evelyn Brooks's hand stopped moving over the counter. Caroline turned to her assistant with something cold rising in her face, but before she could speak, she saw the young woman across the table go rigid. Color climbed up Sophie's neck and into her cheeks. Her hands closed into fists on the tabletop, and her eyes, which had been guarded all evening, blazed. "He's not after anything," she said, her voice low and shaking with the effort of holding it steady. "He hasn't asked her for one thing. She sat down here, not the other way around. You watched it happen, Sophie." Grant's voice was quiet, and that single word carried more weight than all of Preston's. He did not look angry. He looked tired, in the way of a man who had been measured and dismissed by people like Preston his entire life, and had long ago decided it was not worth the breath to argue. "It's all right, let it go." But it plainly cost him something to say it. Caroline watched the muscle work in his jaw, watched him fold his rough hands together on the table and hold still, absorbing the insult, the way a wall absorbs a thrown stone. There was a discipline to it that Caroline recognized, though she could not yet say from where. "Preston, that's enough," she said, and the edge in her tone was one he rarely heard. "You've made your point. Now go wait by the car." He didn't move at first. "I'm doing my job," he said, quieter now, and for a moment the mask slipped, and she saw the fear underneath it, the memory of a photograph that had once run under a headline neither of them ever spoke about the near collapse of everything they had built, the guilt he had carried since. "I let something in once that I shouldn't have. I'm not going to watch it happen again. Not to you. Not to the foundation." "I know what you carry," Caroline said gentler now because she did know. "But you're wrong about this table. Go wait by the car." He held her eyes a moment, then turned and walked stiffly toward the door, and the little bell rang as he stepped out into the cold to stand beside the idling car in the snow. Some of the tension left the room with him. Evelyn resumed wiping the counter, but Sophie was still trembling with anger, and to steady herself, she reached into the canvas bag at her feet and pulled out a worn sketchbook, the kind with a cracked spine and pages soft from handling, and set it on the table as if to have something of her own to hold on to. He does this," she muttered half to herself, flipping it open to a blank page and pressing it flat. People take one look at us and decide the whole story. Caroline's eyes fell on the open book. As Sophie's fingers moved, the pages riffled backward, and for an instant one drawing surfaced from the middle of the stack, a woman rendered in careful pencil, standing alone in the center of a vast, crowded room. All around her were tables full of people laughing, leaning together, and she stood among them, touching nothing belonging to no chair, an island of stillness in all that motion. Beneath it in small block letters ran a title. The Lady with No Table. Caroline's breath caught. She reached out before she could stop herself and laid one finger at the edge of the page. "May I?" Sophie glanced down, saw what had been exposed, and a flush of a different kind crossed her face. "It's nothing," she said quickly, moving to turn the page. "I draw people off the television sometimes. There was a special about your foundation last winter. You were up on a stage with all those people, and you had this look." She stopped, suddenly aware of what she was admitting. "You looked like you were somewhere else, like none of it was really yours." The words landed somewhere deep and unguarded. Caroline stared at the drawing of herself, at the accuracy of it, at a stranger's daughter, having seen through the glass wall she had spent 40 years believing no one could see past. She had felt exactly that standing on that stage. She had never told a soul. And here it was in pencil, drawn by a young woman who owed her nothing and had understood her completely. "You saw that," Caroline said very quietly, "from a television screen." "She sees everything," Grant said. There was pride in it, and something else underneath, something careful. He reached over and closed the sketchbook with a gentleness that suggested he had seen the drawing many times and understood what it meant to his daughter. Gets it from her mother. She could look at a room full of strangers and tell you which one was carrying the heaviest thing. The mention of the mother settled over the table like a held note. Caroline did not ask. She could see in the way both of them stilled that it was a loss that still shaped the air around them. Instead, she looked at the closed sketchbook and then at Grant, and something began to gather at the back of her mind, a sense of pattern of a shape half seen, the way you catch a familiar face in a crowd before you can name it. "You said you fill in at the kitchen and the freight yard." Caroline weighed the words a moment. "It doesn't leave much. And yet," she nodded toward the halved plate, "you'd give away the half you kept." "It's just breakfast," Grant said. "It's not, though." She held his gaze. "People who have almost nothing usually hold on to what little they've got. It's not a flaw, it's survival. But you don't. You give it away like it costs you nothing, and I've spent my whole life around people who wouldn't part with a dime unless a camera was pointed at them." She shook her head slowly. "Where does a man learn to give like that?" Grant was quiet for a moment, choosing his words the way a man crosses thin ice. "You give when you can, even when it's not much, especially then." He looked at the window, at the snow piling against it. "Made a promise a long time ago that I'd send a little something every month to a fund that helps the ones who've got nobody, the ones aging out of the system with no place to land. Never missed a month. Not when work dried up. Not when things got bad." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You keep a promise or you don't. There's no halfway on it." Caroline sat very still. "A scholarship fund. A little something every month for years, kept up through hardship with the stubbornness of a vow." The words were ordinary, but they set off a low ringing in her memory, a sound from very far away. She was 18 again in a narrow bunk at the county group home, holding an envelope with no return address. She had been about to lose her place. No family. No plan, only a door about to close. And then the envelopes had started coming. Small amounts of money, never large, but always arriving at exactly the moment the floor was about to drop out from under her. Enough to cover the fee that kept her enrolled. Enough for the bus that carried her to the interview that changed everything. And with each one a short letter in a plain, steady hand telling her to keep going, that someone believed she would make it, that she owed the sender nothing but the promise to do the same for someone else one day. Each was signed the same way, 2 initials only. GC. She had never learned who it was. She had written back to a post office box and gotten no name in return, only more encouragement until the letters stopped, when she no longer needed them. She had kept every single one. They were locked in a small safe in her home, even now, 22 years later, the most valuable thing she owned. She had built an entire foundation trying to become for other people the ghost who had once saved her, and she had never stopped wondering who GC had been and whether he had any idea what he'd done. Caroline realized her hands had gone cold around the glass. She looked at Grant with new eyes, cataloging him against a memory. The plain, steady hand. The vow kept through ruin. The $2 breakfast split down the middle for a stranger. It could not be. It was a common enough kindness donating to a fund. Half the good people in the world sent a little something to somewhere. She told herself that, and did not believe it. And the not believing frightened her more than she could say. She was still turning it over, unable to speak, when the little bell rang and the cold came in again. Preston had come back. Whatever he had rehearsed standing out there in the snow had hardened into something worse, and he crossed the floor with his phone already out as if he meant to document what he was about to do. "I made some calls," Preston announced to the table loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "About our friend here." He looked at Grant with open contempt. Day laborer. Behind on everything. The kind of man who'd see a woman like Miss Whitaker walk in out of a snowstorm and know exactly what a sad performance in a corner is worth. He set his phone down flat on the table screen up, and the message was unmistakable. "So here's how tonight goes. You take whatever she's already feeling sorry enough to give you, and then you let her get to her event, and you don't turn a woman's decency into your own private lottery ticket." Sophie shot to her feet, the chair scraping loud against the floor. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice cracking with fury, her eyes bright. "You don't know one thing about him. You don't know what he's done, or what he's given up, or what it cost him. You look at that coat, and you think you've got the whole story, and you've got nothing. Nothing!" Grant reached up and touched her wrist. "Sit down, honey," he said softly. "It's not worth it. Let him think what he wants. It doesn't change anything that's true." He did not raise his voice. He simply sat there under the weight of Preston's contempt, refusing to become smaller than he was. But Sophie would not sit down. She looked at her father at the way he was folding himself up small to keep the peace, and something in her broke loose. She turned and crossed the diner in quick strides toward the narrow staircase at the back that led up to the little rooms above the kitchen, the ones Evelyn rented cheap, where father and daughter had been staying since the winter. Turned hard. "Sophie," Grant called after her, and there was alarm in it, now real alarm, the first crack in his composure all night. "Sophie, leave it be." She did not stop. Her voice came back down the stairs, thick with tears and fury. "Mom said there'd be a night like this. She said the truth was for when the lie got too big to leave alone." Her footsteps thudded overhead. "It's too big, Dad. I'm not going to sit here and let them do this to you." Grant was on his feet now, one hand on the table, and for the first time all evening, the calm had left him entirely. "That's not, she didn't mean." But he did not finish, because Sophie was already coming back down the stairs, and in her hands was a small tin box, old and dented, its paint worn to bare metal at the corners, the kind of box a person keeps their whole life and never shows anyone. She set it on the table between her father and Caroline, and her hands were shaking. "Open it," she said to Caroline, ignoring Preston entirely now. "You want to know who he is? Open it. He'll never tell you himself. He spent his whole life making sure nobody knew. Sophie, please." Grant's voice had dropped to something almost pleading. He put his hand flat on the lid of the box, as if to hold it shut, and looked at his daughter with an expression Caroline couldn't read: fear and shame, and something that looked strangely like grief. Some things a man keeps for a reason. Not everything's meant to come out. But Caroline was already looking at the box, and her heart had begun to pound in a way she did not understand. "May I?" she asked him softly, the same 2 words she had used to ask about the drawing. Grant looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he saw in her face, it undid his resolve. Slowly, the fight went out of his shoulders, and he lifted his hand from the lid and sat back down heavily. "Do what you want," he said, very low. "You were always going to, one way or another." Caroline reached out and lifted the lid. Inside lay a life kept in careful order. There were donation receipts, dozens of them stacked and rubber-banded, going back decades, small amounts every single month, to a fund whose name she knew, because it was the one that had once saved her. There was a photograph, its colors gone soft with age, the kind of print the fund mailed each sponsor of the young person their money was helping, showing a thin woman standing in front of the county group home, 18 years old, awkward in thick glasses, squinting into the sun, with the look of someone who did not yet know if she would be all right. Caroline knew that face. She had worn it, and beneath the photograph, tied with a piece of faded string, was a bundle of letters, his own copies, the drafts he had kept before mailing each one. She lifted the top one with a hand that had begun to tremble and unfolded the brittle paper and saw the plain, steady handwriting she had read 1,000 times in the dark. The same encouragement, the same promise asked in return, and at the bottom, in the same careful strokes, the same 2 initials that had haunted her for 22 years. G.C. Caroline looked up slowly from the letter across the tin box, across the halved plate, at the man in the worn coat, who had cut his breakfast in 2 for a stranger, and asked for nothing. At Grant Callahan. And she understood all at once, and far too late, that the ghost she had spent her whole life trying to repay had been sitting 3 feet away from her, the entire night being called a beggar and a thief in a room full of people, and had said nothing at all. For a long moment, Caroline could not speak. She sat with the brittle letter in one hand and the faded photograph of her younger self in the other, and the diner seemed to fall away around her, the flickering light, the storm at the windows, the staring faces. There was only Grant Callahan across the table, watching her with an expression that held no triumph, no relief at being found out, only a quiet, aching dread. "It was you," she said at last, and her voice did not sound like her own. "All of it. The envelopes, the fee that kept me enrolled, the bus fare." She set the letter down with great care, as though it might crumble. "I was going to lose my place. I was 18, and there was nothing after that door closed, and then the money started coming, and it never stopped, until I didn't need it anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "I have every one of these letters in a safe at home. I have read them 1,000 times, and I never knew your name." "You weren't supposed to," Grant said quietly. Preston stood frozen a few feet away, his phone forgotten in his hand, the screen gone dark. He had come back in to expose a con artist, and he was watching instead the collapse of everything he thought he had understood. He looked from the receipts to the photograph, to his employer's stricken face, and slowly the blood drained out of his own. The man he had called a thief in a public room was the one person on earth Caroline Whitaker owed her life to. "Why?" Caroline asked, ignoring Preston entirely. "Why keep it a secret 22 years? You could have come forward at any time. You had every reason to. You have—" Her voice caught as she gestured at his worn coat at the diner, at the halved plate still sitting between them. "You have so little, and you sat here tonight and let a man call you a beggar to your face, when one word would have changed everything." Grant turned his coffee cup a slow half-circle, that old habit, and when he answered, he spoke the way he had all night, without any bid for sympathy. If I'd told you, it would have changed what it was. A gift you have to thank somebody for isn't really a gift anymore. It's a debt." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't do it, so you'd owe me. I did it, so you'd make it. And you made it. That was the whole of it." There was nothing left to say. "Duh, but your name," she pressed. "You signed the letters." "GC, if you wanted to stay hidden, why sign it all?" Something softened in his face. "So there'd be a thread," he said. "Just one, in case you ever needed to find it. I didn't want to be known. But I didn't want to disappear completely either, in case a day came when knowing somebody had believed in you might matter more than the money ever did." He glanced at his daughter, who stood beside the table with tears sliding down her face. Her mother used to say, "You leave a door open a crack. You don't stand in it. But you leave it open." The mention of Sophie's mother settled over them again, and this time Caroline understood the shape of what had happened to this family. A man who had given away his small surplus for years, who had kept his vow through every hardship, and then had watched illness take his wife and leave him with debt, and a grown daughter, and a worn coat, and who had gone on sending his little something to the fund, even then, even from the bottom. He had simply kept the promise, because that was the only kind of man he knew how to be. "You kept donating," Caroline said, the realization arriving fully. "Even when you had nothing left." "You keep a promise or you don't," Grant said again, the same words from before, and they meant even more now. "There's no halfway on it." Caroline looked down at the tin box and thought of her own life. The foundation, the galas, the buildings with her name carved into the stone, the 300 people waiting for her tonight at an event built to be photographed. She had spent 20 years trying to become the ghost who had saved her, and she had never once felt that she had truly understood him. Now she did. He had never wanted the stage. He had only wanted her to make it to the other side. Outside, a phone buzzed in Preston's pocket. The inn, the gala coordinator, 300 guests, and a podium, and a speech printed on cards, all of it waiting. Preston looked at the phone and then at Caroline, and for the first time in 6 years, he did not know what to tell her to do. "They're ready for you," he said quietly. All the contempt had gone out of him. "The car's warm. There's a speech." He swallowed. "Miss Whitaker, if you..." He looked at Grant, and whatever he had meant to say about image and risk, and the photograph he had spent years dreading died in his throat. "I was wrong. About the table. About all of it. I'm sorry." Caroline stood. She gathered the letters and the photograph with great tenderness and laid them back in the tin box, and she closed the lid, and she pushed the box gently back across the table to Grant. Because it was his, and it had always been his. Then she looked at the two of them, the father in the worn coat, the daughter who had defended him, and she made her decision. "Come with me," she said. "Both of you. Tonight." Grant shook his head at once. "That's not us," he said. "Cameras and crowds, and a woman in a white coat parading the poor man she found in a diner. That's not why I did any of it. I don't want a thing from you, Caroline. I never did." "I know," she said. "That's exactly why I'm asking." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to parade you. I promise you that. But I have stood on that stage every year and told a story that had a hole in the middle of it because I never knew how it ended. Tonight, I know, and I am not going to stand up there and tell it wrong or leave you out of it or pretend the person who mattered most wasn't real. Let me tell the truth. Just once. Then you can go back to your coat and your freight yard and your quiet, and I'll never say your name in public again if that's what you want." Sophie looked at her father. "Dad," she said softly, "she kept your letters in a safe for 22 years. Her voice broke. "Maybe it's not about the crowd. Maybe it's just about her getting to say thank you finally. You gave that to her. You could let her have it." Grant looked at his daughter for a long moment, and then at the woman his small kindness had helped carry across 22 years, and something in him gave way. "All right," he said so quietly it was almost lost under the storm. "But I keep the coat." And we sit in the back. The gala hall was warm and golden and full. When they arrived, 300 guests at white-clothed tables beneath chandeliers, the county group home's banner hung above a stage set, with a podium and a microphone and a speech printed neatly on cards. Caroline walked in with Grant and Sophie a few steps behind her. She found them 2 chairs at the very last table in the back, near the doors, and she saw them seated before she went up. She climbed the steps to the podium, and the room quieted, and the applause she had heard every year of her adult life rose and settled. She looked out at the faces at the cameras along the side wall, and then she looked down at the cards in her hand, the speech Preston and his team had crafted, polished and safe and hollow. She set them face down on the podium and did not look at them again. "Every year I stand up here," Caroline began, "and I tell you about the work we do, the futures we try to keep open, and every year I have left out the truest part because I didn't know it yet." Her voice was steady, but only just. "When I was 18, I was about to age out of the very place we're here to support tonight. There was no family. There was no plan. There was a door about to close and nothing on the other side of it. The room had gone entirely still. And then someone I had never met began to send me money. Never a lot. Just enough, always at exactly the moment the ground was about to give way. Enough to keep me enrolled. Enough for the bus that took me to the interview that started everything I have. And with every envelope came a letter telling me to keep going. Telling me someone believed I would make it, asking nothing in return, except that one day I'd do the same for someone else." She had to stop for a moment to keep her composure. "I never knew who it was. The letters were signed with 2 initials and nothing more. I built this entire foundation trying to become for other people the stranger who had saved me. And I did it up here in the light with my name on everything, because that was the only way I knew how." Her eyes found the back of the room. The person who saved me never wanted the light at all. He gave in the dark for 22 years, and he kept giving even after life took nearly everything he had. He never told me his name. I found it out tonight by accident in a diner in a snowstorm, 3 feet away from me, while a man in my own employ was calling him a beggar. A murmur moved through the hall. Caroline did not look at the cameras. She looked only at the last table by the doors. "He is here tonight, and he did not want to be, and I am not going to ask him to stand because he has spent his whole life making sure no one made him stand. I only want to say in front of all of you the thing I have wanted to say for 22 years and never could." Her voice finally broke, and she let it. "Thank you. You kept a door open when I had none, and I made it. I made it because of you." Then, Caroline Whitaker did something no one in that hall had ever seen her do. She stepped down from the podium, and she did not go to the head table where her seat was marked with her name. She walked the length of the room, past the chandeliers, and the white tablecloths, and the turning heads all the way to the back, to the last table by the doors where there was no place card and no camera turned, and she pulled out the empty chair beside Grant and Sophie, and she sat down with them. For a moment, the hall did not know what to do. Then somewhere near the front, someone began to clap, and it spread, and it built, until 300 people were on their feet, applauding a man in a worn coat who would not stand up, who only sat with his rough hands folded on the white tablecloth, and his eyes down, uncomfortable in all that noise, while his daughter cried beside him and gripped his arm. Grant leaned toward Caroline under the roar of it and said the only thing he had to say. "You told it right," he murmured. "That's all I ever wanted, for somebody to get across." In the weeks that followed, Caroline did not turn the night into a campaign. She kept her word. Grant's name never appeared in a headline, never ran beneath a photograph. She used the foundation to open a community education center in Maple Falls, a plain, warm building with no name carved into its stone, a place for the ones aging out of the system, with nowhere to land the exact people Grant had been quietly sending his little something to for 22 years. She ran it the way he had taught her, without ever meaning to teach anyone anything. Quietly, without expectation. With the door left open a crack, Preston oversaw the building of it himself. He asked for the job, and Caroline gave it to him, and he did it well, and he never spoke of the diner again, except once to Grant on the day the center opened, when he shook the man's hand and held it a beat too long and said he was sorry in a voice that meant it. Grant told him it was already forgotten. Coming from him, it was true, and Grant went on exactly as he had before. He still wore the coat with the worn elbows because it was still a good enough coat. He still drove the pickup with the faded paint because it still ran. He still rose before dawn and went down to the freight yard when there was loading and filled in at Evelyn Brooks's kitchen when she was short a pair of hands. He had never given an order to be thanked, and being thanked had not changed him. To a man like Grant Callahan, kindness had never needed a reward to be worth doing. The center still stands in Maple Falls. It has no plaque with his name. Most of the people it helps will never know that a day laborer in a worn coat is the reason it exists, or that the billionaire who founded it learned everything she knew about giving from a man dividing a single plate of pancakes on a winter night. And that is precisely as Grant would have wanted it, because the whole point of the thing was never to be seen. So it is worth remembering the next time you are quick to measure a person by a frayed sleeve or an old coat, or a battered truck, that the one you imagine needs your help the most may be the very one who has been quietly holding someone up for years, asking for nothing, signing no name. Real kindness never needed a witness to be real. It only ever needed a heart patient enough to keep giving, even when no one would ever know.